Salvador Allende was born on June 26, 1908, in Valparaiso, Chile, to an upper-middle-class family, with his father, Salvador Allende Castro, a lawyer, and his mother, Laura Gossens Uribe, a teacher. In 1926, he enrolled at the University of Chile to study medicine, engaging with socialist and Marxist ideas. He graduated as a physician in 1932 and co-founded the Socialist Party of Chile in 1933. In 1937, he was elected as a deputy to Congress, representing Valparaiso and Aconcagua. From 1939 to 1942, he served as Minister of Health under President Pedro Aguirre Cerda, promoting social welfare programs. Elected to the Senate in 1945, he served until 1970, advocating for socialist policies. He ran unsuccessfully for president in 1952, 1958, and 1964 under the Popular Action Front. In 1970, he won the presidency as the Popular Unity Coalition candidate with 36.6% of the vote, becoming the first democratically elected Marxist president in Latin America. From 1970 to 1973, he pursued the Chilean path to socialism, nationalizing industries like copper, implementing agrarian reform, and expanding social programs amid opposition, U.S. interference, inflation, and shortages. On September 11, 1973, a U.S.-backed military coup led by Augusto Pinochet overthrew his government. During the attack on La Moneda Palace, Allende died, officially by suicide, though some debate persists. His presidency and death led to a 17-year dictatorship, and he remains a polarizing figure, admired for social justice efforts and criticized for economic challenges. In 1926, Salvador Allende enrolled at the University of Chile in Santiago to study medicine, beginning his higher education and exposure to political activism, where he started engaging with socialist and Marxist ideas that would shape his future career. He continued living in Valparaiso, his birthplace, commuting for studies while his family remained prominent in local society, with his father working as a lawyer and his mother as a teacher. This period marked the start of his intellectual and political development, setting the stage for his involvement in leftist movements, including his later co-founding of the Socialist Party of Chile in 1933. In 1932, Salvador Allende graduated as a physician from the University of Chile in Santiago, completing his medical studies. During this time, he deepened his involvement in leftist politics, engaging with socialist and Marxist groups. His political activism intensified, leading to his co-founding of the Socialist Party of Chile in 1933, a pivotal step in his emerging career as a socialist leader. Still based in Valparaiso, he balanced his early medical practice with growing political commitments, influenced by the social inequalities he observed, which fueled his advocacy for systemic change. In 1937, Salvador Allende marked a significant milestone in his political career by being elected as a deputy to the Chilean Congress, representing the provinces of Valparaiso and Aconcagua, his home region. Running as a candidate for the Socialist Party of Chile, which he had helped establish in 1933, Allende secured this position through his growing reputation as a committed socialist and advocate for social justice. His election came during a period of political dynamism in Chile, with the Popular Front, a coalition of left-leaning parties including socialists, communists, and radicals, gaining traction against conservative forces. Allende's campaign resonated with workers, students, and progressive intellectuals, focusing on addressing inequality, improving labor conditions, and expanding access to health care, themes rooted in his medical background and observations of poverty during his studies and early practice. As a deputy, Allende began his parliamentary career with energy, using his platform to push for reforms aligned with socialist principles. He spoke out on issues like workers' rights, public health, and education, drawing on his experience as a physician to highlight the need for systemic change to address social disparities. His eloquence and conviction earned him respect among allies and attention from opponents, establishing him as a rising figure in Chilean politics. Outside Congress, he remained active in the Socialist Party, helping to organize and expand its influence particularly in Valparaiso, a key port city with a strong working-class base. Allende's personal life in 1937 was also evolving. He was married to Hortensia Bussi, whom he had wed in 1930, and they were raising their young family, including their daughters, Carmen Paz and Isabel, born in the mid-1930s. His home life in Valparaiso provided a grounding contrast to his demanding political schedule, though his commitment to activism often kept him engaged in meetings, rallies, and travels. As a physician, he continued some medical work, but his focus increasingly shifted toward politics, reflecting his belief that societal transformation required structural reforms beyond individual care. The broader context of 1937 shaped Allende's activities. Globally, the Spanish Civil War intensified, galvanizing leftists like Allende, who saw it as a battle against fascism, a cause he supported through solidarity efforts in Chile. Domestically, economic challenges lingered from the Great Depression, with Chile's nitrate and copper industries facing volatility, fueling labor unrest that Allende sought to address through legislative proposals. His role in the Popular Front positioned him as a bridge between the Socialist Party's more radical elements and the coalition's broader reformist agenda, a dynamic that honed his skills as a negotiator and strategist. By the end of 1937, Allende had solidified his identity as a congressional deputy and socialist leader, laying the groundwork for his later roles, including his appointment as Minister of Health in 1939. His experiences this year, balancing legislative duties, party organizing, and family life, reflected his growing commitment to a vision of socialism that would define his legacy, even as it drew scrutiny from conservative elites and foreign interests wary of his rising influence. Between 1939 and 1942, Salvador Allende experienced a pivotal period that solidified his stature as a prominent socialist leader and public servant in Chile, while deepening his commitment to social reform. This timeframe saw him transition from a congressional deputy to a key government official, serving as Minister of Health under President Pedro Aguirre Cerda's Popular Front administration, while continuing to shape the Socialist Party's direction and navigate personal and political challenges. In 1939, Allende, already a deputy for Valparaiso and Aconcagua since 1937, was appointed Minister of Health, a role he held until 1942. This position, offered by Aguirre Cerda, a radical party leader heading the left-leaning Popular Front coalition, aligned perfectly with Allende's medical background and socialist convictions. At 31, he became one of Chile's youngest cabinet ministers, tasked with overseeing public health during a time of economic strain and social inequality. His tenure focused on ambitious reforms to improve healthcare access for the working class and rural communities. Allende championed policies to expand medical facilities, increase vaccinations, improve maternal and child health, and address occupational diseases, particularly among miners and industrial workers. He introduced programs to combat malnutrition and infectious diseases like tuberculosis, which were rampant among the poor. His 1939 book, La Realidad Médico-Social Chilena, written during this period, detailed the dire health conditions faced by Chile's lower classes, linking poverty to systemic inequities and advocating for state-led solutions. The book, based on his experiences as a physician and minister, became a cornerstone of his reformist vision and a reference for progressive policymakers. As Minister of Health, Allende traveled extensively across Chile, visiting hospitals, clinics, and rural areas to assess needs and implement programs. His hands-on approach earned him admiration among workers and unions but drew criticism from conservative elites and private interests, who viewed his reforms as overly interventionist. The Popular Front government faced broader challenges, including economic difficulties tied to Chile's reliance on copper and nitrate exports, exacerbated by World War II's disruption of global trade. Allende's health initiatives, while groundbreaking, often struggled with limited funding and bureaucratic resistance, testing his ability to balance idealism with pragmatism. Politically, Allende remained a leading figure in the Socialist Party, which he had co-founded in 1933. During 1939 to 1942, He worked to strengthen the party's organization and influence within the Popular Front, navigating tensions between its radical Marxist wing and more moderate coalition partners like the Radicals. His role as a minister gave him a national platform, but it also exposed him to intra-coalition rivalries and attacks from right-wing opposition groups, who labeled him a communist despite his democratic socialist stance. Allende's speeches, both in Congress and at public rallies, emphasized social justice, workers' rights, and anti-imperialism, reflecting global concerns like the fight against fascism in Europe. The Spanish Civil War's conclusion in 1939 and the ongoing World War II reinforced his solidarity with anti-fascist causes, which he expressed through support for refugees and internationalist rhetoric. On a personal level, Allende's life during this period was demanding. Married to Hortensia Bussi since 1930, he was a father to 3 daughters, Carmen Paz, Isabel, and Beatriz, born by the early 1940s. His family remained based in Valparaiso, though his ministerial duties required frequent stays in Santiago and travel nationwide. Despite his hectic schedule, Allende maintained close ties with his family, and Hortensia supported his political work, later becoming a key partner in his presidential campaigns. His medical practice took a back seat, as his roles as minister and politician consumed most of his time, though he occasionally provided free care to underserved communities, reinforcing his reputation as a doctor of the people. The period was not without setbacks. In 1941, President Aguirre Cerda's death weakened the Popular Front, and his successor, Juan Antonio Rios, faced growing internal divisions and economic pressures. Allende's health reforms, while impactful, were curtailed by budget constraints and opposition from conservative lawmakers and business groups. By 1942, he stepped down as Minister of Health, returning to his role as a deputy and preparing for a Senate run in 1945. This transition allowed him to refocus on grassroots organizing and party leadership, setting the stage for his long senatorial career and presidential bids. Globally, the early 1940s shaped Allende's worldview. The rise of fascist regimes and the economic fallout of World War II underscored his belief in state-driven development and resistance to foreign domination, particularly by U.S. interests in Chile's copper industry. His experiences as minister honed his skills as a policy advocate and coalition builder, while exposing him to the challenges of implementing socialism within a democratic framework, a tension that would define his later presidency. By 1942, Allende emerged as a seasoned politician, respected for his health reforms and principled stance, yet increasingly targeted by conservatives wary of his growing influence. His work during 1939-1942 laid the foundation for his lifelong pursuit of equitable development, cementing his identity as a champion of the marginalized and a critic of systemic injustice. Between 1939 and 1942, Salvador Allende navigated a transformative phase in his career and personal life, serving as Chile's Minister of Health under the Popular Front government, advancing his role in the Socialist Party, and laying the groundwork for his future as a national leader. This period, marked by intense political activity, social reform efforts, and global upheaval, shaped his vision of democratic socialism while testing his resilience against domestic and international challenges. In 1939, Allende, already a deputy, in Chile's Congress since 1937 representing Valparaiso and Aconcagua, was appointed Minister of Health by President Pedro Aguirre Cerda, leader of the Popular Front, a coalition of socialists, communists, radicals, and other left-leaning groups. At 31, Allende was among the youngest cabinet members, chosen for his medical expertise and socialist commitment to addressing Chile's stark social inequalities. His role as minister, which lasted until 1942, became a defining chapter, allowing him to translate his ideals into policy. Drawing on his experience as a physician, Allende focused on improving public health for Chile's working class, rural communities, and urban poor. He spearheaded initiatives to expand access to medical care, including building new clinics and hospitals, particularly in underserved areas. His policies targeted maternal and child health, launching programs to reduce infant mortality through better prenatal care and vaccinations. He also tackled occupational health, addressing diseases like silicosis among miners and tuberculosis, which disproportionately affected laborers. To combat malnutrition, a widespread issue tied to poverty, he promoted school feeding programs and public health campaigns. A key intellectual contribution during this period was Allende's 1939 book, La Realidad Médico-Social Chilena, a detailed study of Chile's health crisis. Written while he was minister, it documented how poverty, inadequate housing, and lack of sanitation fueled disease and mortality, arguing that only structural reforms, such as state intervention and wealth redistribution, could address these issues. The book, grounded in data and personal observations from his medical and political work, became a manifesto for his vision of social justice and influenced progressive health policy in Chile. Implementing these ideas, however, was challenging. Chile's economy, reliant on copper and nitrate exports, was strained by the global disruptions of World War II, which began in 1939. Limited budgets and bureaucratic inefficiencies hampered Allende's reforms, while conservative elites and private medical interests resisted his push for state-led healthcare, accusing him of overstepping government bounds. As Minister of Health, Allende traveled extensively, visiting remote regions, factories, and mining communities to assess conditions and promote his programs. His direct engagement with workers and peasants bolstered his popularity among the masses, who saw him as a dedicated advocate. However, it also drew scrutiny from Chile's right-wing media and political opponents, who labeled him a radical despite his pragmatic approach within the democratic system. His visibility as a minister elevated his national profile, making him a target for those wary of the Popular Front's leftward tilt. Politically, Allende remained a central figure in the Socialist Party of Chile, which he had co-founded in 1933. During 1939 to 1942, he worked to expand the party's influence, particularly among urban workers and trade unions in Valparaiso and Santiago. The Socialist Party, part of the Popular Front, advocated for nationalizing key industries and land reform, but tensions arose within the coalition. The Radicals, the coalition's largest party, leaned more moderate, while communists and socialists, like Allende, pushed for bolder changes. Allende's role as a minister required him to navigate these divides, balancing his party's radical ideals with the coalition's need for unity. His speeches, delivered in Congress, at party rallies, and to labor groups, emphasized workers' rights, anti-imperialism, and solidarity with global anti-fascist struggles, reflecting the era's ideological battles. The Spanish Civil War, ending in 1939 with Franco's victory, and the ongoing World War II, which pitted democratic and socialist forces against fascism, deeply influenced Allende. He supported efforts to aid Spanish Republican refugees in Chile and spoke out against Axis powers, aligning his domestic agenda with internationalist principles. Beyond his ministerial and party duties, Allende continued serving as a deputy until 1942, proposing legislation on labor protections and social welfare when not focused on health policy. His dual roles demanded a grueling schedule, often keeping him away from his family. Married to Hortensia Bussi since 1930, Allende was a father to 3 daughters by this period: Carmen Paz, born 1931, Isabel, born 1935, and Beatriz, born 1941. The family lived primarily in Valparaiso, though Allende's work required frequent stays in Santiago and travel across Chile. Hortensia, a supportive partner, managed the household and later became a key ally in his political campaigns. Despite his public commitments, Allende remained devoted to his daughters, though his intense schedule limited family time. His medical practice, once a primary focus, became secondary, though he occasionally offered free care to poor patients, reinforcing his image as a compassionate physician-politician. The political landscape shifted significantly during this period. In 1941, President Aguirre Cerda died unexpectedly, a blow to the Popular Front's cohesion. His successor, Juan Antonio Rios, a radical, struggled to maintain the coalition amid economic woes and growing conservative opposition. Inflation, shortages, and labor strikes, exacerbated by wartime trade disruptions, created a challenging backdrop for Allende's reforms. By 1942, facing these pressures and internal coalition strains, Allende stepped down as Minister of Health. He returned to his role as a deputy and began preparing for his next political chapter, including a successful Senate run in 1945. His departure from the cabinet reflected both the practical limits of his reforms and his desire to refocus on broader socialist organizing. Globally, the early 1940s reinforced Allende's ideological convictions. The war highlighted the dangers of unchecked capitalism and imperialism, as he saw it, particularly U.S. influence over Chile's copper industry. His experiences as minister exposed him to the complexities of governing within a coalition and the resistance faced by socialist policies in a capitalist-dominated economy. These lessons shaped his later strategies as a senator and presidential candidate, emphasizing democratic reform over revolutionary upheaval. Personally, Allende faced the strains of public life. His relentless schedule, meetings, speeches, travels, took a toll, though he maintained a disciplined routine, rising early and working late. His charisma, noted by colleagues, helped him build alliances, but his outspokenness also made enemies among Chile's elite, who viewed him as a threat to their interests. Socially, he remained connected to Valparaiso's intellectual and working-class circles, often discussing politics and literature with friends over wine or at cultural events. By 1942, Allende had emerged as a seasoned leader, respected for his health reforms and socialist advocacy, yet polarizing for his critiques of inequality and foreign influence. His tenure as minister, though constrained by resources and opposition, left a lasting impact on Chile's public health system and solidified his reputation as a principled reformer. This period honed his skills as a policymaker, orator, and strategist, preparing him for the decades-long struggle that culminated in his 1970 presidency. In 1945, Salvador Allende reached a significant juncture in his political career, transitioning from a congressional deputy to a senator, while continuing his leadership in the Socialist Party of Chile and navigating personal responsibilities amid a shifting national and global landscape. This year was marked by his election to the Senate, ongoing advocacy for socialist policies, and engagement with international issues, all while maintaining his family life in Valparaiso and reflecting on the challenges of advancing reform in a polarized Chile. Having served as a deputy for Valparaiso and Aconcagua since 1937 and as Minister of Health from 1939 to 1942, Allende was a well-known figure in Chilean politics by 1945. Early that year, he campaigned for a Senate seat, representing the provinces of Valdivia, Lanquihue, Chiloé, Aysén, and Magallanes, a diverse and geographically expansive region in southern Chile. Running as a Socialist Party candidate, Allende leveraged his reputation as a dedicated advocate for workers, peasants, and social justice. His campaign emphasized expanding labor rights, improving public health and education, and challenging the dominance of foreign companies, particularly U.S. firms controlling Chile's copper industry. The election, held in March 1945, saw Allende win decisively, reflecting his growing appeal among urban workers, rural communities, and progressive intellectuals. His victory marked the start of a 25-year tenure in the Senate, 1945-1970, where he would become one of Chile's most prominent legislators. As a newly elected senator, Allende quickly immersed himself in legislative work, using the Senate as a platform to propose and debate policies aligned with his socialist vision. He focused on issues like land reform to address rural inequality, nationalization of key industries, and social welfare expansion, building on the health reforms he had championed as minister. His speeches, delivered with conviction and backed by his medical and policy expertise, addressed the systemic roots of poverty and exploitation, earning him admiration from allies and criticism from conservative senators who viewed him as a radical threat. Allende's role in the Senate also involved committee work, where he scrutinized budgets and legislation, often clashing with right-wing opponents over government priorities. His ability to combine intellectual rigor with grassroots appeal made him a formidable presence, though his outspoken critiques of Chile's elite and foreign influence drew increasing scrutiny. Beyond the Senate, Allende remained a leading figure in the Socialist Party, which he had co-founded in 1933. In 1945, the party was navigating internal debates over its direction, with some members favoring a more revolutionary approach and others, like Allende, advocating for socialism through democratic means. He worked to strengthen the party's organization, particularly in Valparaiso and Santiago, meeting with union leaders, students, and local activists to expand its base. The Socialist Party was part of the broader left-wing coalition, the Democratic Alliance, which had succeeded the Popular Front and supported President Juan Antonio Rios. However, coalition tensions persisted as the radicals leaned moderate, while socialists and communists pushed for bolder reforms. Allende's role as a bridge between factions honed his diplomatic skills, though he faced criticism from more militant socialists for his pragmatism. The global context of 1945 profoundly influenced Allende's activities and worldview. World Issue. War II ended in August with the Allied victory, a moment of triumph for anti-fascist forces that Allende celebrated as a socialist and internationalist. He had long supported the fight against fascism, including aid for Spanish Civil War refugees in Chile, and the war's end reinforced his belief in collective action against oppression. However, the emerging Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union began to shape Latin American politics, with the U.S. intensifying its influence in Chile to counter communist and socialist movements. Allende, wary of U.S. imperialism, spoke out against foreign control of Chile's copper mines, a stance that resonated with nationalists but alarmed Washington and Chile's business elite. The war's economic fallout, including trade disruptions and inflation, also fueled labor unrest in Chile, which Allende addressed through Senate proposals and public rallies, solidifying his ties to the working class. On a personal level, Allende's life in 1945 was anchored in Valparaiso, where he lived with his wife Hortensia Bussi and their 3 daughters, Carmen Paz, 14, Isabel, 10, and Beatriz, 4. Married since 1930, Allende relied on Hortensia's support to manage family life amid his demanding schedule of Senate sessions, party meetings, and travel to southern Chile for constituent work. His role as a father was important, though his political commitments often limited time with his daughters. He made efforts to connect with them through conversations and outings when possible, and his home remained a hub for political discussions with colleagues and friends. Allende's medical practice, once central to his identity, was now minimal, as his focus shifted fully to politics, though he occasionally provided free care to underscore his commitment to the poor. Chile's domestic politics in 1945 were turbulent. President Rios, struggling with health issues and coalition fractures, faced strikes and economic challenges tied to post-war recovery. Allende, as a senator, supported the government's progressive measures, but criticized its hesitancy on structural reforms, advocating for greater state intervention in the economy. His visibility made him a target for conservative media, which portrayed him as a dangerous leftist, despite his adherence to democratic principles. Socially, Allende maintained a vibrant network in Valparaiso, engaging with intellectuals, artists, and workers at cafes or cultural events, where he discussed politics, literature, and global affairs. His charisma and accessibility strengthened his grassroots support, though his rising profile also intensified opposition from Chile's elite. By the end of 1945, Allende had cemented his role as a senator and socialist leader, poised for a long career in national politics. His election to the Senate expanded his influence, allowing him to shape debates on Chile's future, while his party work and internationalist outlook positioned him as a voice for the marginalized in a world entering the Cold War. The year tested his ability to balance legislative duties, ideological battles, and family life, reinforcing his commitment to a democratic path to socialism, a vision that would define his later presidential campaigns and presidency. Between 1952 and 1964, Salvador Allende solidified his status as a leading figure in Chilean politics, running 3 unsuccessful presidential campaigns, 1952, 1958, 1964, while serving as a senator and shaping the Socialist Party's direction. This period was defined by his relentless advocacy for democratic socialism, growing international prominence, and navigation of personal and political challenges amid Cold War tensions, economic struggles, and Chile's polarized political landscape. Allende's experiences during these years honed his strategies and resilience, setting the stage for his eventual 1970 presidential victory. In 1952, Allende, a senator since 1945 representing southern provinces, ran for president as the candidate of the Popular Action Front, Frente de Acción Popular, FARAP, a coalition of the Socialist and Communist parties. His campaign championed nationalizing Chile's copper industry, dominated by U.S. firms like Anaconda and Kennecott, agrarian reform to redistribute land, and expanded social programs for workers and peasants. At 44, Allende's platform, rooted in his medical and ministerial experience, emphasized addressing inequality through democratic means, a Chilean path to socialism. The 1952 election, however, was dominated by other candidates, including Carlos Ibáñez del Campo, a former president running as a populist. Allende's campaign, while energizing the left, struggled with limited resources and media hostility from conservative outlets. He secured only 5.5% of the vote, finishing fourth, a distant result that reflected the left's fragmentation and the Socialist-Communist coalition's limited national reach. Despite the loss, the campaign elevated Allende's profile, establishing him as the left's standard-bearer and strengthening his resolve. Returning to the Senate after 1952, Allende continued advocating for socialist policies, proposing bills on labor rights, public health, education, and resource nationalization. His legislative work focused on challenging the economic power of Chile's oligarchy and foreign corporations, earning him support among unions and rural workers but fierce opposition from conservatives and business interests. As a senator, he traveled to his constituencies in Valdivia, Lanquihue, Chiloé, Aysén, and Magallanes, engaging with fishermen, farmers, and laborers to address local concerns like infrastructure and wages. His speeches, blending Marxist analysis with practical solutions, resonated with the working class, while his eloquence and charisma made him a formidable debater in Congress. Allende also played a key role in the Socialist Party, pushing for unity and organizational growth. The party faced internal debates, with some favoring armed struggle and others, like Allende, committed to electoral politics. His leadership helped maintain the party's democratic orientation, though tensions persisted. In 1958, Allende ran for president again under the FRAP banner, now better organized and buoyed by growing leftist momentum. At 50, he campaigned on a bolder platform, emphasizing copper nationalization, land reform, and anti-imperialism, critiquing U.S. influence in Latin America amid Cold War rivalries. The Cuban Revolution's 1959 success, though after the election, inspired Allende and his supporters, framing socialism as a viable regional alternative. The 1958 race was highly competitive, pitting Allende against Jorge Alessandri, conservative, Eduardo Frei, Christian Democrat, and others. Allende came remarkably close, securing 28.9% of the vote to Alessandri's 31.6%, losing by about $33,000 votes. The narrow defeat highlighted his growing support but underscored challenges. Conservative media smear campaigns labeled him a communist, and the Catholic Church, influential in Chile, opposed his secular stance. The loss was disappointing, but it galvanized Allende's base and the FRAP coalition, proving socialism could challenge the establishment. Between 1958 and 1964, Allende intensified his Senate work and party leadership. Re-elected to the Senate, in 1961 he represented new constituencies, including Aconcagua and Valparaíso, adapting to Chile's redistricting. His legislative efforts focused on structural reforms, such as taxing foreign companies and expanding social services, while he critiqued government policies under Alessandri's conservative administration, which faced inflation, unemployment, and strikes. Allende's Senate speeches often addressed global issues, reflecting his internationalist outlook. He traveled abroad during this period, visiting the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba, where he met Fidel Castro in 1960, strengthening his belief in socialism's global potential. These trips, widely covered in Chile, bolstered his leftist credentials, but fueled accusations of communism from opponents, despite his insistence on a democratic path. Allende's anti-imperialist stance, particularly against U.S. dominance in copper, aligned with rising nationalist sentiments in Latin America, though it drew covert attention from the CIA, which began monitoring him. In 1964, Allende ran for president a third time, again as the Frei P candidate. At 56, he was a seasoned politician, his platform refined to emphasize revolution in liberty, socialist transformation through democratic institutions. The campaign promised copper nationalization, agrarian reform, and universal health care, appealing to workers, students, and intellectuals. However, the 1964 election was heavily influenced by Cold War dynamics. The U.S., wary of another Cuba, funneled millions in covert funding to Allende's opponent, Eduardo Frei of the Christian Democrats, through the CIA, while supporting anti-Allende propaganda. Frei's moderate reformist platform, promising revolution in liberty without socialism, attracted centrist voters. The Catholic Church and conservative media intensified attacks, portraying Allende as a Soviet puppet. Despite a strong campaign, Allende won 38.9% of the vote to Frei's 56%, a wider margin than 1958 due to U.S. intervention and centrist consolidation. The defeat was a setback, but Allende's near 40% vote share signaled the left's growing strength. Throughout 1952-1964, Allende's political life was inseparable from his Socialist Party role. He mediated internal factions, advocating for coalition building with communists and other leftists, while resisting pressures to abandon electoral politics. His travels to socialist countries and Latin American leftist gatherings enhanced his stature as a regional figure, though they invited domestic criticism. In Chile, he remained a tireless organizer, speaking at union halls, universities, and rural cooperatives, often facing harassment from right-wing groups. His commitment to grassroots engagement kept him connected to constituents, even as his Senate duties and campaigns demanded extensive travel. Personally, Allende's life centered on his family in Valparaiso, though his schedule strained his time at home. Married to Hortensia Bussi, he was a father to 3 daughters, Carmen Paz, Isabel, and Beatriz, now teenagers and young adults by 1964. Hortensia played an active role in his campaigns, organizing women's groups and accompanying him at events. Allende cherished moments with his daughters, discussing politics and culture, though his absences were frequent. His Valparaiso home hosted political allies, intellectuals, and artists, reflecting his love for literature, music, and debate. Financially, Allende lived modestly, relying on his Senate salary as his medical practice had long ceased. His health remained robust, sustained by a disciplined routine, though the stress of campaigns and opposition attacks tested his resilience. Chile's context during 1952-1964 was turbulent. Economic dependence on copper, controlled by U.S. firms, fueled inequality and inflation, sparking labor strikes and social unrest. The Cold War polarized politics, with the U.S. backing anti-socialist forces and the Soviet bloc inspiring leftists. Allende's campaigns rode a wave of growing class consciousness, but faced entrenched opposition from Chile's elite, the church, and foreign interests. Natural disasters like the 1960 Valdivia earthquake, the world's strongest recorded, added to economic woes, shaping debates Allende engaged in as a senator. By 1964, Allende was a towering figure, respected by supporters as a principled visionary, and vilified by opponents as a radical. His 3 presidential losses, while disheartening, built a loyal base and refined his strategy of uniting the left. His Senate work, international ties, and grassroots organizing kept socialism viable in Chile, paving the way for his 1970 triumph. This period showcased his perseverance, ideological clarity, and ability to navigate a hostile political landscape, cementing his legacy as a democratic socialist icon. Between 1970 and 1973, Salvador Allende lived the most consequential and dramatic years of his life, serving as president of Chile after his historic election as the world's first democratically elected Marxist leader, only to face intense opposition, economic turmoil, and a violent military coup that ended his life and presidency. This period was defined by his ambitious pursuit of the Chilean path to socialism, his navigation of domestic and international challenges, and his personal commitment to his family and ideals, all unfolding against the backdrop of Cold War polarization and U.S. intervention. In 1970, Allende, a senator since 1945 and veteran of 3 failed presidential runs, 1952, 1958, 1964, ran for president again as the candidate of the Popular Unity Coalition, a broad leftist alliance including the Socialist Party, which he co-founded in 1933, Communist Party, and smaller groups. At 62, Allende campaigned on a transformative platform, nationalizing Chile's copper industry, controlled by U.S. firms like Anaconda and Kennecott, implementing agrarian reform to redistribute land, expanding social programs for healthcare, education and housing, and deepening democracy through worker participation. His vision of socialism via democratic institutions, distinct from Soviet or Cuban models, resonated with workers, students, peasants, and intellectuals frustrated by inequality and foreign dominance. The September 4, 1970, election was fiercely contested, with Allende facing Jorge Alessandri, conservative, and Radomiro Tomic, Christian Democrat. Allende won a narrow plurality with 36.6% of the vote, 1,070,334 votes, to Alessandri's 34.9% and Tomic's 27.8%. As no candidate secured a majority, Congress decided the outcome. After intense negotiations, Allende secured Christian Democrat support by signing a statute of constitutional guarantees, pledging to uphold democratic norms. On November 3, 1970, he was sworn in as president, a historic triumph for the global left. As president, Allende moved swiftly to implement his program, known as the Chilean Path to Socialism. In 1971, he nationalized the copper industry, Chile's economic backbone, via a unanimous congressional vote, compensating U.S. companies minimally based on assessed value. This move, celebrated by nationalists, infuriated the U.S. government and corporations, prompting economic retaliation. Allende also nationalized other sectors, including banks, steel, and textiles, aiming to shift economic control to the state and workers. Agrarian reform accelerated, redistributing large estates to peasants and cooperatives, fulfilling long-standing rural demands but disrupting agricultural production and alienating landowners. Social programs expanded rapidly. Free milk was provided for school children, wages for low-income workers rose, and healthcare and education access improved. Worker councils and community organizations were encouraged to participate in governance, reflecting Allende's vision of participatory democracy. These reforms galvanized the poor and working class, who rallied at massive demonstrations, but sparked fierce resistance from the upper class, business sectors, and conservative media, who labeled Allende's policies chaotic and authoritarian. Economic challenges mounted early. Nationalizations and wage increases boosted demand but strained production, leading to shortages of goods like food and consumer products. Inflation, already high at 22% in 1970, soared to 140% by 1972, eroding purchasing power. The U.S., under President Nixon, imposed a covert economic blockade, pressuring international banks to deny Chile loans and restricting copper exports, as declassified documents later revealed. Nixon's order to make the economy scream was executed through CIA funding of opposition groups, media, and strikes, including a crippling 1972 truckers' strike that paralyzed supply chains. Allende's government struggled to manage these crises, resorting to price controls and rationing, which fueled black markets and public frustration. Middle-class support waned as shortages and long queues became daily realities, though Allende retained strong loyalty among workers and peasants. Politically, Allende faced a polarized Congress, where the Popular Unity held a minority. The opposition, Christian, Democrats, National Party, and others, blocked legislation, impeached cabinet ministers, and accused Allende of constitutional overreach. The judiciary and military, traditionally conservative, grew hostile, with the Supreme Court clashing with Allende over property expropriations. Within the Popular Unity, tensions arose. Allende's Socialist Party included radical factions pushing for faster, even armed revolution, while he and the Communists advocated gradualism to preserve democracy. Public divisions deepened, with pro- and anti-government marches turning violent. Right-wing paramilitary groups like Patria y Libertad attacked leftist targets, while some leftist militants armed themselves, escalating tensions. Allende, committed to nonviolence, resisted calls to arm supporters, believing it would justify repression. Internationally, Allende's presidency was a Cold War flashpoint. He strengthened ties with Cuba, the Soviet Union, and other socialist states, hosting Fidel Castro in 1971 and visiting Moscow in 1972 to seek aid. These moves, while securing some loans and trade, alienated the U.S. and fueled domestic accusations of communism, despite Allende's democratic framework. The CIA, as later Senate investigations confirmed, spent millions destabilizing his government, funding opposition parties, newspapers like El Mercurio, and labor disruptions. Allende's speeches at the United Nations in 1972 denounced U.S. imperialism and multinational corporations, earning global admiration but intensifying Washington's hostility. His non-aligned stance, supporting Third World solidarity, made him a symbol of resistance, but Chile's economic dependence limited his leverage. Personally, Allende's life revolved around his presidency, though he remained rooted in family and principle. He and Hortensia Bussi, married since 1930, lived in Santiago, with Hortensia active in social initiatives and women's organizations. Their daughters, Carmen Paz, Isabel, and Beatriz, were adults, with Isabel serving as a congressional deputy and Beatriz, a doctor, advising his administration. Allende maintained close bonds with them, often discussing politics at their Tomas Moro residence, though security concerns grew as threats against him mounted. His Valparaiso home remained a retreat, where he hosted allies, poets, and musicians, indulging his love for literature and Chilean folk culture. Despite the presidency's toll, Allende projected calm, rising early, working late, and maintaining a frugal lifestyle. His health, robust in 1970, showed strain by 1973 from stress and minor ailments, though he remained active. Chile's crisis deepened in 1972-1973. The October 1972 truckers' strike, backed by the CIA and opposition, crippled the economy, prompting Allende to appoint military officers, including General Carlos Prats, to his cabinet to restore order. This move temporarily eased tensions but exposed military divisions. In March 1973, congressional elections saw the Popular Unity gain 43% of the vote, a strong showing but short of a majority, emboldening the opposition to escalate destabilization. A June 1973 tank rebellion, Tancatazo, signaled military unrest, and Prats's resignation left General Augusto Pinochet seen as loyal as army commander. Strikes, sabotage, and violence intensified, with Allende's calls for dialogue rejected by an opposition bent on his removal. On September 11, 1973, a U.S.-backed military coup led by Pinochet overthrew Allende's government. As the Air Force bombed La Moneda, the presidential palace, Allende refused to resign or flee, delivering a final radio address affirming his commitment to Chile's people and democracy. Surrounded by loyal aides, he defended the palace with a rifle, reportedly a gift from Castro. Official reports state Allende died by suicide, shooting himself with the rifle to avoid capture around 2 p.m., though some supporters later questioned this, alleging assassination. The coup, confirmed by declassified U.S. documents to have CIA support, ended his presidency and life at 65, ushering in Pinochet's 17-year dictatorship, marked by repression and thousands of deaths. During 1970-1973, Allende's presidency transformed Chile, achieving historic reforms, copper nationalization, land redistribution, social gains, while facing insurmountable odds, U.S. sabotage, economic collapse, and internal divisions. His commitment to democracy, even under siege, earned him global reverence as a martyr for socialism, though critics blamed his policies for economic chaos. His family, especially Hortensia and Isabel, carried his legacy in exile, advocating for human rights. Allende's life ended tragically, but his vision of equitable democratic change endures as a symbol of resistance.